Gurmagat Cahirlook. Well, it's become standard practice in this Dáil, week after week. Government ministers traipse in here and they cry crocodile tears for struggling families across the state. Strangely, it never seems to dawn on those same ministers, or indeed their cheerleaders on the backbenches, that it is in fact they themselves who are responsible for the hardships that families endure. Taxing the family home is a deeply unfair measure. 1 in 4 families are experiencing mortgage distress. Tens of thousands of young homeowners are now burdened with negative equity, all having paid significant monies in stamp duty. Recent ESRI and NESC reports have starkly illustrated the impact of the economic crisis on young families. The ESRI report, entitled Younger and Older Households in the Crisis, describes the impact of the crash on younger groups as, and I quote, large by both international standards and in a historical comparison. And the reports pose the question as to how best to address the disproportionate impact this crisis has had on Ireland's young households. And the government give their response to these dismal statistics and reports. And what's their answer? Well, their answer is to heap even more debt, even more stress on struggling households. And it's quite mind-boggling that any government would introduce a tax on the family home in the aftermath of a huge property bubble, which, as we all know, burst and left hardship in its aftermath. Labour and Fine Gael's dogged refusal to even include an ability to pay clause in the legislation is truly astonishing. Because, you see, you tell us that you know that people are suffering. You tell us that you're all about reform. You tell us that you're all about fairness. Yet you refuse to include a standard provision to protect families who simply don't have another euro or another cent to give. It seems to me that you're obviously not listening to the families who no doubt contact your constituency and your Dáil offices. The NESC report also acknowledged that the succession of harsh budgets since 2008 has impacted hardest on families with children. 22% of all households are now without any work, and the report says that 1/4 of all children are living in jobless households. And yet this is the demographic of citizens that Labour and Fine Gael are seeking to dip their hands into the pockets of again. And please don't tell us that you don't have any options or choices. Don't point to the Troika or to the abysmal administration of Fianna Fáil. Yours is the government that balks at the very suggestion of modest tax increases for those on very high incomes, or on ensuring multinationals meet their tax obligations in full. And the question for families across the state is this: where's the heavy-handed treatment of senior bankers when it comes to their pay and pensions? Or, for that matter, as the banks hike up interest rates, where's the heavy-handed approach for retired politicians who enjoy bumper pensions? You can only conclude that the introduction of this type of tax demonstrates an absolute contempt for citizens. The message from government has been pay up or else. And we see this very clearly in the design of the legislation itself. Never before have I seen such a cynical and heavy-handed approach to force people to cough up a tax, even if they simply cannot afford it. You have to know that 1 in 4 households are experiencing mortgage distress. I'm sure you're aware that 65,000 local authority tenants are struggling to meet the costs of their rent. And yet your response is cough up or else. There isn't a choice, to your mind, as to whether or not people can or should meet this tax. You simply insist and use the revenue commissioners to force families to meet this additional debt. You're using the revenue commissioners to dip into these people's pockets and create more hardship by taking monies directly from bank accounts, social welfare payments, payroll if necessary. Big Brother, the heavy hand of the state. And you won't even give some margin to people who you have to know can't afford this additional tax. People who are out of work, people who are struggling by on pensions, not of the variety enjoyed by former Taoiseach and senior civil servants. Because you won't even offer a deferral to those people. No, instead you say that you will offer an exemption to those people. Instead you offer a deferral. Property tax payments for people who have suffered a significant and unexpected financial loss or expense. This is what you say. But we all know that in practice, this won't be applicable to even very many families in very real distress. The mean-spiritedness of this legislation is astounding. You decide to plough ahead with this tax. It was rushed through this Dáil. You wanted to minimise debate and maximise pain. Unemployment remains perilously high. You've not introduced any meaningful measures to tackle mortgage distress, and 1/3 of the children of this state live in deprivation. I can only conclude that you are cosseted somehow from the harsh realities facing citizens. And for so many families, this property tax will simply be a debt too far. In addition, the tax makes no economic sense. We know that the domestic economy has been and remains in distress. This measure will arguably only damage the local economy even further. Families will be forced to pay the tax, and as a result, basic necessities will be forfeited. Oil will not be got this winter. A much-needed trip to the doctor or dentist will be put off yet again. That will be the achievement of the tax on the family home. Sinn Féin is opposed to the property tax on the family home, and we have made an absolute commitment that if in government, we will axe this unjust tax. And our legislation this evening represents the means by which this tax can be brought to an end. And to every member of the Dáil who says that they are concerned for struggling families, for each of those deputies, there is an onus on them to come in here and to vote in support of this legislation. If you care about fairness, if you really understand the struggles of families, well then really this should be a no-brainer for you. Sinn Féin will continue to campaign against this tax. We know that even those families and households who have registered and who will meet revenue and who do wish to be tax compliant, the vast majority of those families are doing so under protest because they too are struggling. So shame on this government for introducing what they have to know is a deeply unfair and inequitable tax at a time when you have and have had so many other options.